Hello, everyone. Welcome to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and with me today is Vox. Here, despite just today. Well, no, was it today? When did you get the surgery?
Friday. Friday.
Oh dear Lord! So she is a trooper. Everybody has to go out and thank her. I am aware we are buffering a bit, and I am not entirely sure why our system had to be basically completely rebuilt, so I will take a look and see what's running in the background, see if it's something that I can control versus something I can't. But at any rate, thank you all for joining us. If you, we're going to have our patron hangout. The shows all got pushed back, so we're going to do a patron hangout coming up. If you're not a patron yet, please think about joining. You get all sorts of extra benefits. You get to talk to us. You get to talk to us on anyone on the Discord. We're going to be on the Discord immediately after the show. Hopefully we can get Dr. Carrier to join us. And we're going to have a good time.
You know, you get more of me, right? I don't know who this guy is over here, but, come out with me.
This is what I have to put up with. So wouldn't change it for anything. But at any rate, so...
do you have like a random stock photo of me up there that's not me? It's some other dude?
Yeah, no, so we've got, and just because of the nature of the NDI, unfortunately, Carrier's mic is going to be hot, but we don't have that's not some random dude, that's another co-host, but he's not here right now, and I didn't get a chance to replace that. So what we're going to do today, ladies and gentlemen, is we are going to have Mouty is here with us today, and but he's going to sound a lot like Carrier, and he's going to be talking about Bayesian analytics. That's Mouty right there. So we'll bring him on. We'll have a great show. What can I say? Carrier didn't show up. He must have heard all those things I was saying about him, which, quite frankly, if only you knew. I basically never talked to the guy except when he's on a show. But trust me,
I don't know. You're playing it pretty straight. People might actually believe you.
I got to be careful with that because I have a
you
very
see your
dry
audience drop off. Oh, Richard Carrier's not on.
I have a very dry sense of humor, and it has gotten me in trouble. I play it straight. I always play it straight. I have enjoyed, and Carrie and I have chatted actually outside of the show, but what could I say? I got that sense of humor, and it doesn't get me in as much trouble as it gets other people. So, Vox, how are you doing? And what's you looking forward to tonight?
Good. Yeah, absolutely. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I'm doing good. Recovery was easy. I was expecting, to go a little bit rougher than it did, but no swelling, no nothing. So I was willing to get on camera. The week's kind of blown by. I'm now on vacation, which is fantastic. So we're down here at the beach, and where I'm at, in the latter part of the South is one area of the United States that's not under ice at the moment. So, it's about 55 degrees outside right now. Slight breeze, got the ocean going on in the background. So I am just as fit can be right now.
Nice. All right. Well, today's show, we have on Dr. Carrier back. We had him, I think, still one of our most popular shows was him and Ozzy discussing philosophy of religion as part of our philosophy series. And then we've also had him on, I think our second most popular show was also Dr. Carrier for the Historicity of Jesus, which was a spectacular episode. We really enjoyed that. So I think without any further ado, let's bring out Mowdy or
Mowdy.
Dr. Carrier, how are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you so much for coming. So now, here's the thing. You almost every time you come on this show, you mention something about either Bayesian analytics or sort of applying a Bayesian model to, especially for the historicity of Jesus, and we talked about what was the likelihood that he actually existed. And so it was something where I said we really wanted to have you back to discuss this and what this model actually is. So can you tell us? Can you give us sort of the 5,000-foot view of what is it we're talking about when we say Bayesian analytics?
Well, I mean, I'll clue the audience in here. Like you had asked me, like, let's talk about Bayesian analytics, and I immediately shot back like, no, I think you mean Bayesian reasoning or Bayesian epistemology. Yes, and so, like right. the first. And I wrote a whole blog on this, actually, because this is a mistake, a confusion that's very common, because most people are so math phobic, especially historians, academic historians hate math. Even though what I'm talking about here is 6th grade math. It's super easy, very simple stuff, but people freak out about it. But what they'll do is they'll go and look like Bayes' theorem in its application in the sciences, and then freak out because it's like complex differential equations and all kinds of stuff. And yes, you can do really, really advanced, impressive, complicated math with Bayesian analytics, which is where you use Bayes' theorem to analyze data, and you can use all kinds of complicated software for it and various things. You'll find it in science papers, you'll find it in industry, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is Bayes' theorem as an equation actually models all empirical reasoning. And you can use that to show that an argument is sound or unsound. You can explain why the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises and what the premises are by looking at the Bayesian structure of it. And it's much simpler. You don't have to do any advanced statistics or anything like that to use it as a reasoning tool. And that's what I write about. I have tons of articles on this subject for all levels of people who want to explore it, even if you want to go totally intro stuff and things like that, on my blog, which is richardcarrier.info for people who want to look into that. If you want to go really deep, my book, Proving History, was a peer-reviewed academic monograph arguing that all historical methodology, all historical reasoning and argument is all Bayesian. And that ends with a final chapter that gets in much more detail and heavy meta-mathematical stuff. But in general, it's just a simple thing that once you get the equation, it becomes a marvelous tool that you can use to even fix up and improve your own thinking in any domain, really. And the funny thing is I was very anti-Bayesian. There was a moment when there was this particular philosopher who was arguing that you should use Bayesian methodology to analyze arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, right? And I was arguing with him, no, you can't. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't work here. Blah blah blah. And then there was a moment, like that key eureka moment, when I realized I was wrong. And you have that moment, and I'm like, oh man, I've been wrong this whole time. And then at that moment, I realized, wait a minute. What you're saying is brilliant. This is brilliant. This tool is fantastic. And that's what led me to introduce it into history as a methodology and then apply it to the historicity of Jesus. So what is it? What are we talking about here? Can we bring up the odds form? Were you able to make that work? Or is that
did. Well, we're gonna find out. So I will put that in the, well, there you go. It's right there.
Yeah,
it's a little big.
So this is
that might be.
There are many.
That might be.
I think that looks good here. Oh, okay. Now it's tiny.
Well, okay. Well, there you go. I will put it up there. It's gonna, yeah.
It's gonna cover my. Now I'm like a superhero that I have like a Bayesian helmet. Okay.
I can mess with that a bit, maybe.
Bayes' theorem can be represented in many different ways. There's many equations. They're all the same equation. They just reduce to different forms. This is the simplest one, and so it's the easiest one to explain. You can move on to more advanced ones later if you want. But basically, and this is odds. So you know odds, like 3-to-1 odds on something. It's a 3-to-1 chance something will happen, or 100-to-1, or 1,000-to-1 against, or whatever. These are odds. And so this is an odds equation, and it's telling you what the odds are on a hypothesis you're proposing. So HP they have up there is the hypothesis that you're proposing. HD is that hypothesis is false. There's some other thing explaining the evidence. So you're doing what is the ratio between these two things? What are the odds on your hypothesis being true or false? And so that's the question you're asking. How likely is my theory on the evidence? Is it 3-to-1? Is it 100-to-1? 1,000-to-1? 1,000,000-to-1? What is it? Mm-hmm. And what you're asking is, what is the probability of your hypothesis given the evidence, right? And so that's what you see in the first. Let me see if I have my hand in the correct direction. There it is. The probability of a hypothesis given the evidence. And that's what you're asking. And here we're looking at the ratio between the hypothesis being true and the hypothesis being false. Oh, nice. There you go.
Yeah, I can actually, yeah, I'm going to move that just to figure out where I'm going to put that right there. And there we go.
And when you're plugging numbers in this, you don't even need to know the probabilities. You just need to know the odds. So is it even odds? Is it 50-50? Then it's 1-to-1, right? It's simple ratios, basically, fractions. Nothing complicated. And the answer to that question is, what are the odds on my hypothesis being true? The answer to that question is simply 2 other fractions multiplied together. And it's all other empirical knowledge. Every piece of your argument is in these 4 other numbers that you see there. And the first that's shown here is the likelihood ratio, which is how likely is the evidence. So if you're asking what is the probability of your hypothesis given the evidence, well, to answer that question, you have to ask, what is the probability of the evidence given my hypothesis? And then, here's the big trick, you ask, what is the probability of that same evidence on some other hypothesis that would rule out mine? And you're doing that ratio. That's the one on top and the one on the bottom. The one on top is how probable is the evidence on your hypothesis. The one on the bottom is how probable is the evidence on the best competing hypothesis. Really, it's on probability in any other hypothesis, but that's more advanced mathematics stuff. Usually, you can just test against the best alternative explanation and see what the odds are on your hypothesis being true. And so that is actually what evidence is. So when someone says, this is some item of evidence is evidence for a hypothesis, what they are actually saying is that evidence is unlikely unless their hypothesis is true. That is actually what people are asserting. Now, whether they're right or wrong is a whole other question, but it's what they're asserting. They're claiming that this evidence wouldn't exist, or it just wouldn't likely exist, unless their hypothesis was true. That's the claim they're making, which means they're saying this odds ratio is high. They're saying it's like 10-to-1, right, or 100-to-1, or whatever their research, how confident they are, how unlikely would this evidence be on any other explanation. And then so once you figure that out, the next thing is, what are the prior odds? Like what usually is the case? And this is the one that trips people up a lot. Like, this is why miracles, for example, we've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of investigations, scientific, careful investigations of miracle claims, and they always comes out bogus one way or another. Like the story wasn't true, or it was exaggerated, or it had another explanation, etc. So we know in advance that when someone comes along with a new wild, crazy claim, like demons levitated this person, we know the odds on that the prior odds on that are extremely low, because usually those stories turn out to be bogus. Whereas, other claims might usually turn out to be true, because it depends on what is usually the case. So and that's what people in colloquial terms call plausibility. When you say, that theory is not plausible, what they're really saying is that the odds against it, the prior odds against it, are low before we even look at the evidence. It's just we're starting low. And if you're starting low, you need more evidence. And this is the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? An extraordinary claim is a claim that has low prior odds. It's like maybe 1,000,000-to-1 would be a really extraordinary claim, which means your evidence has to be really, really unlikely unless your theory is true to overcome those prior odds. So you need really good evidence to overcome. You need 1,000,000-to-1 evidence in favor of your theory to overcome 1,000,000-to-1 against your theory. So anyway, that's the basic idea. And if people really want to toy with this and figure it out, I've got many blog articles that you can go into it further. But you can pick any argument for God, argument for climate change, argument for the Democrats being cannibal pedophiles, whatever you want, you can go to this equation and you can find whatever the person is arguing. You can say they're arguing the numbers in here. They don't know they're saying numbers, but they are. You know, saying this is very unlikely. Well, very unlikely is a mathematical term. You're talking about numbers here. So let's talk about what you mean. What is very unlikely? Give me an odds. Like, what is your benchmark for very unlikely? And why do you think it's very unlikely? And then, so you can actually use this as a tool to analyze arguments and figure out where someone is going wrong, or figure out how to make your argument more solid. What do you need to present to really make this case? And I've done this. My famous article is one of my most popular ones, which is Bayesian counter-apologetics. It's on my blog, where I took the top 10 arguments for God, and I show that, in fact, all those arguments are arguments against the existence of God. The trick is that when you put the evidence back in that Christian apologists and Muslim apologists and so forth leave out, it flips the equation. So everything that they're claiming is unlikely unless God exists ends up being the other way around. It means very unlikely if God exists. And you can do this with a fine-tuning argument. You can do it for the argument, obviously the argument for evil, but you can do it, pick any argument from consciousness. You pick any argument, it flips the other way as an argument against God once you can figure out the Bayesian model of that argument. And so that's one example of how you can apply this knowledge. I don't know if I've mystified and confused or lost anybody, but that's my basic simple rant about...
question.
Yeah.
And the first question that comes to mind, and I'm sure the first question that comes to mind for a lot of people watching this is, okay, so we've got this equation here, and we now need to enter in information into this equation. So how do we take, the meteorite, killed the dinosaurs? How do we turn that into a number?
Right. Now, of course, there are ways to do it under scientific peer review. That's for scientists, right? They can do that. But when we're just like ordinary people trying to like figure out things, we don't need to know the exact numbers, right? We can use what's called a fortiori reasoning, where we pick a number that's so far against the conclusion we want, but it's still within the realm of reasonable. So you can say, like, I don't know what the exact statistical odds are of a meteorite hitting my house tomorrow and destroying it. But there is a number. I could probably go out and find it. Like scientists have probably figured out what is the statistical odds of a meteorite hitting a particular square foot on Earth, right? So you could do the math if you wanted. But I do know for a fact, it's whatever it is, it's less than 1 in 1,000. Because were it not, my house would have been hit multiple times already, right? So you can start with 1,000 to 1 against, and you know the odds are actually way lower than that. But you can still use that. Plug that number in, do the math, and so whatever number you get out, you know it's going to be even lower because once you put real numbers in, it's going to do is lower it further. So you can do that kind of like ballparking and use numbers that don't have to be exact, but just have to be like in the realm of what you're looking at and hit your margins of error. Which, of course, is what they're teaching in math classes now in America. The idea of estimating is more important than exactitude. The ability to just guess numbers rather than get close is good enough in most cases. It's very inefficient to try and get an exact number. But if you can estimate quickly, and that's the kind of thing that we do with Bayesian reasoning. We throw numbers in that we know are wrong, but are wrong in such a way that if we fix them, we know they're only going to make the conclusion stronger. And that's the trick to using it in a colloquial sense, in a commonplace sense.
So I guess then the next question, of course, would be, because, we all have different worldviews and come from different backgrounds, we accept different epistemics. And of course, a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew is most likely going to accept some form of revelatory epistemics.
Yeah.
That their percentages or their odds are going to be higher than, say, yours. So, for instance, if you would ask them, did John get exiled to the island of Patmos? They're going to say yes, and they're going to say, like 1 in 10, or something like that. Where you might say, well, it's 1 in 10,000. So then, how do we kind of get around that bit?
That's actually that's what's valuable about this, right? Is like once you've gotten to that point, well, now we know we're arguing over a number, so now we can talk about where our numbers are coming from. So you can ask the Christian, like, why do you say 10 to 1? Like, what's the basis for that? Like, what's your benchmark? What's your comparative? And then we end up having to do that too, right? So we have to start examining, like, why am I saying that that's unlikely? It's funny you picked a question that I'm kind of 50-50 on. So I don't really, not adamantly against or for whether John was exiled to the island of Patmos or not. But I think the evidence is weak either way on that. So, but you do like miracles, for example, and we can talk about, well, like, what is the basis for saying that, what is it, Sam's mom's cataracts on Sam's mom's eyes? Is that the Tim Minchin song? Is it Sam? I can't remember the name. Tim Minchin is the musician who does the song God cured the cataracts on.
Yes, God cured the cataracts on my mom's eyes, and you can't prove. Yeah.
I think it's Sam's that story. But anyway, the person Sam, who's making this argument to him in the song, is like, oh, of course, her eyes were healed, therefore it must have been God. So he's like putting way higher priors on God doing it. But what Sam then goes in and he throws in all these other hypotheses that actually explain the evidence better. It actually makes the evidence more likely. And what Sam does is put more evidence in. So like Sam's looking at his mom's eyes were cured. But Tim Minchin comes on in his song, adds, well, let's look at all the evidence, all the cataracts that haven't been healed, all the religions in which that make your religion false, and yet their cataracts were healed. If you add all this data in, you go like, well, what are the odds that maybe 1 out of a million people like has a spontaneous remission of cataracts or a misdiagnosed cataracts or whatever naturally, versus what are the odds that you would have this just randomly across religions, with regardless of who you worship or who you pray to, or even if you don't, the odds of you getting your cataracts recovering are the same, right? So when you look at the evidence that way, the probability of the whole body of evidence is very unlikely if God is doing it, but very likely if it's scientific things. So it's a question of, then you start talking about the evidence and why are you picking that number, and are we leaving evidence out when we're figuring that out? And so that gets you to arguing over what really matters, like what's really at the heart of your premises and assumptions.
Sure. So it sounds to me, though, it sounds like this is not something that could be used almost like a colloquial argument, because I would imagine that what we would run into is intellectual dishonesty.
Oh, yeah.
This sounds like something that requires that all the participants be extremely intellectually honest when they start analyzing themselves, because basically it sounds like what this is almost a razor for bias-y. You have to be able to put aside your bias and say, well, am I really that confident in this, or could it be less? And so I guess that's why you start to talk about everything else that could, like with the cataracts, you say, okay, you think God did it.
The whole body of evidence, yeah. But of course, this is true. What you just said is true of all methods of argument, right? You take even the Kalam cosmological argument. You have William Lane Craig come in and uses standard Aristotelian deductive logic to prove God exists. That's actually a fraudulent use of logic. Like the premises he just throws in premises that are indefensible and just asserts that they are true and throws out some whim-wham to try and argue that those premises are true. But the premises aren't defensible. So even ordinary logic can be abused this way. And Bayes' theorem is the same way. You can find, there's Unwin as an example. Swinburne has done it. They've produced bogus uses of Bayes' theorem to try and bamboozle people with the mathematics, so that is a danger. But that's also a danger for ordinary logic. So you gotta be aware of that. The difference is that Bayes' theorem actually has all the premises in it that you need for an empirical argument, whereas deductive logic can't do that. Deductive logic is always the premises are either true or false, and then the conclusion either follows or it doesn't. It doesn't really deal with probabilities. And what we're really talking about are probabilities here. And so we have to be honest about that and say, what are the premises, the hidden premises in our argument? Prior probability is a hidden premise that people are already, that's, like you said, it's a measure of bias. So you're putting that bias into your argument anyway, whether you know it's Bayesian or not. What we can use Bayes to do is say, okay, here you're putting this bias in, you're putting this prior in. Let's talk about, is that bias valid? Or should you be biasing the prior that way? And so it really exposes these hidden premises that people are relying on. And the other side is figuring out what it actually is about evidence that makes it evidence. And what is it that makes strong evidence strong and weak evidence weak? What is the difference between strong evidence and weak evidence The difference is this likelihood ratio. So when you understand that, then you know you're really talking about probabilities. How likely is this evidence on alternative explanations? And taking alternative explanations seriously is really crucial. It teaches you that you really can't leave those things out. And in fact, the only way, it shows the only way that you can prove anything true is to try really honestly hard to prove it false and fail. That's what Bayes' theorem teaches you. And once you learn that, like it's eye-opening and very enlightening. And in the end, when I argue in a Bayesian fashion, I often don't mention that I'm doing it. I don't mention numbers. I don't mention Bayes. I just make an argument. Now, if someone who knows it, they can see the structure in my argument, what I'm doing. But I can use it that way. So we don't even have to talk math. We can do it without numbers even. In proving history, I have a flow chart where you can do Bayesian reasoning without any actual numbers at all. So it is a logic, and I think it is the logic of probabilistic reasoning, which is the logic of empirical reasoning. And once you get that, once you figure it out, it's a powerful tool you can apply in a lot of ways to improve your own thinking and analyze other people's thinking.
Yeah, I think the first things that most of us will learn in like an introduction to epistemics or introduction to knowledge or something like this is the difference between conclusive, non-conclusive, and inconclusive justification for whether or not something is true or not. And so this sounds almost like just using those basic things, whether or not is my evidence here conclusive, is it something that would fall in that category, or is it non-conclusive, or is it really inconclusive stuff that I'm dealing with and trying to kind of pop here into this non-conclusive category to raise the property, and is that my own bias or something like that? So how do you respond to, because I guess you have used this particular method in order to really kind of create a lot of your views, which of course in the academic community, for those who don't know you, are fairly controversial, I think.
In many ways, yeah.
You and Robert Price are really the only, I think, what we consider like advanced academics that do this kind of not only rejection of the existence of God, but the rejection of the existence of Jesus, and low probability.
There's a lot more of us, and I'm the only one who's applying Bayesian analysis. Well, actually, there's two of us applying Bayesian analysis. Raphael Lataster and myself have both published under peer review, making Bayesian arguments for at least historicity agnosticism regarding Jesus. There are many other historians, some of whom are even who doubt the historicity of Jesus. There's a Catholic, Thomas Brodie, is a devout Catholic, still a believing Catholic, but he thinks he can justify Catholicism based on a non-existent Jesus, because it's a symbolic myth that sort of captures.
I've heard
the
that
meaning.
before. I've heard that one.
Yeah, Catholic doctrine. So there's Zeba Crook is a famous atheist, or not famous, but a well-known atheist professor of religious studies or biblical studies in Canada, and he and I have debated the historicity of Jesus formally, and he's since come out like he's slid a little bit more towards the doubting side. And I have an article on the Bart Ehrman historicity recap article, because Ehrman hates mythicists, so he really does not like us at all.
Yeah, I've had opportunity to sit in. I live about 20 minutes from Ehrman, and so
that's right. Yeah, of course, right.
So I had the opportunity to sit in, and yes, he's not fond. Now I'm sure he's quite fond of you as a person, but maybe not so much your. Maybe not so.
Yeah,
your views.
Probably not. No, he probably doesn't really like.
And so how do you go? Because it seems to me that the criticism that gets levied against, as far as I can tell, is that you don't give enough weight to, so for instance, the historical accuracy of the Gospels, or at least the Gospel's ability to kind of give us a general understanding of what may have occurred back then. There is, the name escapes me right now, but there's the argument for Jesus's existence historically via the lie of omission, which is something to the effect of there are lies in the Bible about Jesus, just outright lies. And why would somebody need to lie about someone if they were a fictional character? You would only need to lie about them if they were, in fact, a real person that, you could go back and check or something like that. And so what would your response be that you just don't put enough, credit or enough weight to some of these more arguments in favor of the historical Jesus?
Or like
it's funny.
The Hitchens argument.
I was just going to use that as an example. But these are two different things. How we weigh certain evidence in the Gospels is a separate question from what you mentioned. Why would you lie about a non-existent person? Because that's a good example of how you need to make sure you're structuring the hypotheses correctly when you compare them. So in the Jesus myth theory, the theory is that everything about Jesus is a lie. It's in the same way that everything about Hercules and Zeus are lies. It's all made up. It's all made up with a mythic purpose. And mythology worked in the ancient world in a certain way, where you would tell fictional stories that symbolize certain things, and then the allegory would communicate what you wanted. And there was also a religious practice of putting these in actual historical stories for outsiders who don't get the secret inside knowledge. And the classic example is the one that the mystery religion that was super famous right next to Judea at the time, which was Osiris cult. And we have Plutarch tells us that, and he's writing this essay to a priestess of Isis and Osiris. He tells us that the priests tell the story of Osiris as a historical pharaoh, and they write gospels and have like an actual historical, he's on earth interacting with earthly historical things, and he's got a biography and a birth and death and family and the whole deal. All of that is fiction, but they don't tell the public that. You have to become baptized in, and then you're told that these are all allegories for this secret cosmic death and resurrection narrative where Osiris is actually up in outer space, and this is all him battling Set and stuff like this. There's stuff going on in the cosmos. The historical narrative is all fake, but it's meant to convey things in a sort of a hidden way. And once you get that as the structure, now you understand why people are not only inventing stories about Jesus, but why they're competing stories, because how you write the story is how you're telling the message. So you have like the Gospel of Mark is trying to have a Jesus be the Jesus that everybody is following, worshiping as the sky god thing, but who's okay with giving up Jewish dietary laws, right? So Mark has written this gospel sort of explain Gentile Christianity. Matthew does not like this. Matthew is a Jewish Christian. He does not think Gentiles can be Christians. They have to convert to Judaism. So he rewrote Mark, and he rewrote Jesus to be a very anti-Gentile Jesus, or a very anti-Gentile Jesus. You have to convert to Christianity. So Matthew's Jesus is not one jot or tittle of the law will go away until the end times. So like where they're very adamant, that's really arguing against Mark, and they're using fictional stories, fake stories about Jesus to argue with each other. And then Luke comes along and tries to reconcile them, and John comes along and says "fuck you" to all the others. When you understand what's going on, these contradictions are deliberate. These books were originally written by competing sects arguing with each other by changing the myth, essentially. And myth was a propaganda. It was a tool for this way. And similar to the way we see today, the mythical narratives that QAnon people have versus the mythical narratives that moderate conservatives have versus the mythical narratives that even liberals will invent, and so on. They have these competing mythical narratives of American history, and it's the history of America, but they're all different versions of it. And some of them are more accurate to historical reality, and some are completely divorced from reality. But it's the myth that matters. So that's why people try to construct that stuff.
How much time? So let's say we've got these four competing people, probably even more, right? There was probably many more that were competing against each other.
There were at least 40 gospels that we know of, but yeah.
Yeah, and then along comes Paul, right, and does his whole
he's
thing.
Before. Paul is before. This is the other thing. Paul wrote in the 50s, so Paul's letters, well, half of them are forgeries, but the half of them that are authentic, they were written in the 50s. The Gospels don't start to get written until the 70s, and they span to maybe about the 120s. Somewhere between 70s and the early 100s is when the Gospels are written. After Paul and all the first apostles, so far as we know, are dead. So it's a human lifetime later, basically, is when the Gospels came out. But to get to your question regarding Bayesian reasoning, and Nicholas brought up the Hitchens' argument. It's a very common one. The Hitchens' argument is, why would the Gospels say Jesus came from Nazareth and then have to invent a whole weird, complicated story for how he gets born in Bethlehem? Right, so like that would suggest that this is evidence that Jesus really did come from Nazareth, and they couldn't get rid of that somehow. They couldn't just drop it. And in truth, they could have just dropped it. But anyway, and that's a good example of a Bayesian argument, where you're saying it's unlikely. So the probability of this evidence that they would say that he came from Nazareth and go through this big complicated method to get him also from Bethlehem, it's unlikely that they would do that unless he really was a Nazarene. He really was from Nazareth. They couldn't somehow suppress this information, so they had to work around it. And that in itself, like in the way it's framed, is a valid argument. You're saying like it's very low probability that would be the case unless he came from Nazareth. Then it's high probability, and so you get a high ratio, and that becomes good evidence for the historicity of Jesus. You could say 10-1 or whatever in favor of the historicity of Jesus. So it would increase the probability that Jesus existed 10 times, which, that's a huge boost, basically. Or say the odds, increase the odds that Jesus existed. Now, the problem is that the premises are wrong. The data being put into this are wrong. And when you go back and look at the evidence, it's very clear that Nazareth came from Scripture. Matthew outright says that Nazareth is the reason they said he came from Nazareth is because Scripture said that. There's a variety of reasons why they thought Scripture or could have thought why Scripture said that, but they thought Scripture said that, so they had a scriptural reason to make him come from both places. And when we look at the earliest version of this storyline, the use of this language, the word for Nazarene is not the name for someone who comes from Nazareth. Grammatically, it's actually the wrong structured word. And we have other sources that explain that Nazarene actually meant something else. It didn't have to do with where he came from. It had something to do with who he was or what he was.
Yeah.
And when you put all this data back in, then the unlikelihood of this data disappears. Now it looks very likely that if Scripture said he had to come from Nazareth and they were trying to make Scripture fit, and a good example is Matthew's trying so hard to get Scripture to fit Jesus that when he gets Mark's story of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, Matthew goes to the old Hebrew prophecy text and he sees the Hebrew poetic style of duplicating, where you say the same thing twice. Matthew takes that literally, and he said so he has a donkey and the foal of a donkey. So it's a donkey and a baby donkey. Jesus is riding on both of them simultaneously in Matthew. So Matthew has taken the one donkey in Mark and had Jesus do this weird acrobatic feat of riding a baby donkey and adult donkey at the same time, just to get it to fit Scripture. So that's how adamant Matthew is of trying to make the story fit Scripture. And of course, Matthew is the first person who really builds out this idea that Jesus came from Bethlehem as well as Nazareth. That's not unheard of in Mark. Mark never mentions a Bethlehem birth. But Matthew's obsessed to make these prophecies fit, and so he tells a convoluted story that makes the methods fit. So the evidence actually ends up being just as likely on the myth theory once you look at all of the data. And that's the key here. Like, once you understand what the argument is, then you can go look at what the data is, what the evidence is, and see, are we assigning the right likelihood ratio to this or not? And that's, when you pull at threads, it unravels, I've found in Historicity of Jesus. I didn't expect that to be the case, by the way. I thought it was just as likely one way or the other that I could end up with a different conclusion. But no, every thread I pull on just undid the sock. So every time there was evidence for it. But that's the Bayesian thinking gets you on the right lead of what you're looking for and what you test, how you test your theory by, and what data you should be looking at and how you figure it out and what you're looking at in terms of probabilities and so forth. So that's one example for using the tool. It'd be nice to give an example that isn't related to religion, though. Can we think of some other argument?
You brought up one, and I think it would be wonderfully relevant just to, because I had a conversation about this earlier today with someone who I ended up insulting, and it wasn't my intention to insult him. But the idea that, the Democrats and Joe Biden stole the election, that
right.
There is rampant fraud, that and then of course that Donald Trump is in fact the rightful president, and it would be, I think, fascinating to apply this to that.
Yeah, interesting. I last month every month I teach courses online. So if people can go to my website and find classes that I teach. And I do critical thinking, philosophy, history. I do Historicity of Jesus. I do all this stuff. But one of them is critical thinking, and I do a 1-week unit on Bayesian reasoning. And one of the challenge questions, one of the assignments for the students, is to pick one of these arguments and do a Bayesian analysis of it. And he picked that one, actually. He picked the argument for and against fraud. And it was a good teaching example. He did a pretty good job, actually, of building it out and showing, like, well, this is the structure of the argument they're making, and this is how they're getting the numbers they're getting, and this is why that's wrong. And you can show, like they're making assertions, putting assertions in that are not factually true. They're substituting rumor for fact, basically. Whereas if you go and just put facts in, don't make any inferences beyond the facts, just put the facts in, the probabilities they go the other way, right? They go strongly the other way. And it's interesting when you're dealing with someone like that who's really delusionally convinced of things like that. It can be helpful to, like, find something that they agree with, right? Like something unrelated to that, and show how, like, do the same thing they're doing to the vote evidence, do it to that evidence, and until they complain, and then you go, oh, see, see, I was doing the same thing to the evidence that you were doing over to this that you were doing over there. Now, do you get why maybe you shouldn't be doing that to the evidence? You shouldn't be over-trusting just rumors, unverified rumors, or ignoring data like the extensive multiple recounts in Georgia that completely disproved the Dominion theories, the Dominion voting machine theories. And that's the other thing, is that they have contradictory theories. Like the Dominion voting machines changed everything. Well, multiple recounts and audits refuted that. And then they went to, the signature matching. It's actual physical fraudulent votes. It's not Dominion electronic fake votes. But then, okay, well, let's look at how hard it would be to fake thousands and thousands of signatures on ballots and so forth. And again, there was even a signature audit in Georgia. So even that got knocked down. So, like, if you put all the evidence in, obviously it falls out. The probability of all that evidence is just massive. The probability of all that evidence, if there was massive fraud, is so low that there's just no reason to believe that that's the case. Whereas they're arguing that's the other way around. And so they're using Bayesian reasoning to get to their case. It's just that they're basically inventing evidence rather than evaluating the actual evidence. And yeah, I realize when people are that lost in delusion, it can be exceedingly difficult to get them to see reason. That Bayes' theorem might not help you there. I don't know. That's a psychological problem more than an epistemological problem.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's probably both, because it just seems like you're talking about this and you're saying this is like 6th grade mathematics. And, if the equation, if we're starting from that equation, it really is.
Times one fraction gets you one fraction. It's actually, that's less than 6th grade math. When you do the probabilities version, when you actually use percentages and multiply percentages, in America, the first time you're taught how to multiply percentages is 6th grade. But if you know how to multiply percentages, you're ahead of the game. Because you don't even need percentages when you do the odds form. You just need odds. And lots of people who play poker, who do any kind of gambling or sports stuff, that odds, right? A lot more people intuitively understand odds. And in fact, our brains evolved intuitively to understand odds. Pigeons can do odds calculations. We've done experiments showing that pigeons can figure odds out. So the odds form is super simple. That's probably 4th grade math. As you get a little more advanced, you do the percentages and stuff. You're doing multiplying decimals and things. That's 6th grade math. But no, when you bring that up again, Nicholas, the odds form. And when you bring it up, it looks fucking scary. It looks like fucking Russian.
Oh, wait, the one that so this is the one that you gave. Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not even the scariest version of Bayes' theorem. I can show you even scarier versions.
All this thing, from now on, when you talk to your students, this is now known officially as the Bayesian helmet.
Wait, I can't. I gotta go this way.
Well,
wait.
Oh.
Yeah. No, it does. It's just because there's so much information on that screen in that equation that you blank out and you're like, oh, that's too confusing. But really, it's just 6 numbers, right? And so this particular form, which is the only one I could find that was large enough on the internet at the last minute for this show, this particular form looks very busy, so it looks more confusing. There are other formats that looks much simpler. But you do need to capture the what's actually in this equation. What are we talking about? And it's probability of hypothesis given the evidence equals the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis times the prior. And that's you're doing it with ratios, but other than that, that's all you're doing. But yeah, so it looks scary, but that's because people are so uncomfortable with math. We've done a very bad job in the US, at least, of making people comfortable with mathematical language. And so this looks scary, but it's really 6th grade math. It's not actually that advanced. It's just because there's a lot of word letters in there. It just looks confusing, and it can be off-putting in that sense. But I think people can get over that once you know how to see it. And that's just like learning a new alphabet, right? Like learning Chinese or learning as a Cyrillic alphabet for Russian or something like that. Like when you first look at it, it looks, oh, no way I'm going to understand that. But once you do, then it just becomes intuitive and it's easy.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Nick.
So I had a question, which is, it seems to me that one at least possible objection is that you end up with kind of a garbage in, garbage out, which at least it seems to me we've seeded in one respect, which is if you're not putting in the proper evidence, you're not going to reach the proper conclusions.
I mean,
but it's
always the case. It doesn't matter what method you're using, whether you're using Aristotelian logic, whatever method you're using, it's always GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So you do have to be on your guard against that, but you always do. No matter what method you're using, no matter what the logic is, you've always got to be on guard. I mean, like I said, the Kalam cosmological argument is garbage in, garbage out. Is a classic example of that.
But if now you have probabilities going in, and I would assume that you would use the Bayesian method to get those probabilities, and then you could ask where do those probabilities come from, and where do those probabilities come from, and so I would foresee two problems. First of all, you end up growing well beyond the scope.
There is an end to that regress, but yes, go on.
And then that's the second one is it sounds like an infinite regress. So how would you deal with that what I would see as a potential objection?
Yeah. Now, first of all epistemologies suffer this problem, right? Is when you try to justify anything, it's a syllogism. It's like, oh, how do you justify that premise? Syllogism. How do you justify that premise? Syllogism. And so, like, well, when does this stop, right? Like, that's true for every epistemology. And the thing is, when I wrote Sense and Goodness Without God, that's my first book, came out in 2005, and that was my complete worldview, all the Aristotelian categories, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, politics, right? All down in there. When I wrote that book, I was not a Bayesian. I hadn't even heard of Bayesian reasoning at that point. Later, when I became a Bayesian, I could go back and look at the epistemology that I was building in there and see I was intuitively already kind of getting there, but wasn't there in fundamentally. But I had solved that problem in terms of it all ends with raw sensory experience, right? I can say positively with 100% certainty that I am experiencing a certain thing now. Now, if I go beyond that, like say like this computer right here is actually a physical thing, that you actually exist, that you're in a different state in a physical location. And like if I'm adding all those inferences, I'm going beyond the raw sensory data. But I'm doing that by statistical inferences, right? And in fact, we found neuroscientifically that your brain is already doing this. Your brain is Bayesian inherently. When you or I or anybody construct a visual field, and we decide what it is that we see in the field, we've shown neurologically our brain is doing Bayesian calculations. It's using prior probabilities and evidence ratios to, in a crude analog way, to generate, like, guess at what we're seeing, like what is here and so on. When you catch a ball, you're doing the same thing. Your brain is like guessing like probabilities and stuff. It's just not doing it digitally; it's doing it analog. But still, so ultimately, it gets down to raw sensory data. And everything built up on top of that is just statistical sampling of the data and what you're coming out. You're doing priors and likelihoods all the way back up. In truth, no one has the time to sit down and work this out for every belief all the way down to raw sensory data. No one's ever done this. And because you don't have to, because you can use what I was talking about before, that a fortiori reasoning, you can guess with probabilities that are so far against what obviously is the case, and show that even with those wildly inaccurate guesses, you still get the particular conclusion. And you can show that if you get more accurate, you would only get a more confident conclusion. So you can build Bayesian epistemology out. You can end infinite regress at raw sensory data and build up your perception and your inferences from there and show you could justify everything that way. And it's really the same thing you would do with any other epistemology, basically. Like whether you're doing it deductive syllogisms or any other kind of inductive method, it's you're doing the same thing. So that isn't really an objection that's unique to Bayes' theorem. It's the same problem that all epistemologies face, and Bayes' theorem solves it the same way that all epistemologies would, that could in any case.
I laughed only because I hate to say this, but we have an audience filled with solipsists. Don't answer me how that happened. but trust me, and now if you check out the live chat, you are about to see what I'm talking about. So you said, well, I'm here, you're here. We know that. Nah, wrong audience. Wrong audience, Richard.
You joke, but there's a legitimate point there. So this Bayesian epistemology has led me to become more interested in Cartesian demon philosophy. Because any solipsistic argument, and that's always what we're trying to say, how do I know it's not just all in my head, right? Like that is really the fundamental epistemological question. And it's particularly pressing because we know a lot of it is only in our head. Humans are so prone to delusion that we can construct a complete artificial version of reality in our heads and convince ourselves that it's true. Humans are highly prone to this. So how do we know we haven't fallen victim to that? It's a challenging psychological question, and you can defeat solipsism, or you can show that it's improbable through a Bayesian technique, through Bayesian epistemology, because you have to start figuring out hypothetically how does your hypothesis predict the phenomenon. So if true solipsism, you would be God, right? You could just change your reality by thinking differently. So what is the line? Reality is what when you kick it, it hurts or whatever. It's what kicks back. It doesn't conform to your will, right? That's you have to kick reality and see, does it resist your will or not? That's when you know what's real and what's not. Just your imagination. So that's the same thing with Bayesian reasoning. The probability that your brain is so brilliant and yet has this weird, mysterious motive to fool you in this very specific, strange way, where it does your will in some cases, but not in others. To try and explain that requires this extremely complicated Rube Goldberg-esque device to come up with it. And the probability of that is extremely low because it has so many components, and you don't have any evidence for any of them, right? So the probabilities, they stack, right? The probability just goes down and down and down because you have to assume so many things. Whereas if you just say, there's an external reality and I'm kicking it, that's way simpler and requires far fewer assumptions. And so its prior probability shoots way up. So solipsism dies really at the hearth, almost immediately. Once you start analyzing what would actually be required to explain the weird features of your experience, why it reacts and behaves in certain ways and not others. The reality theory, realism, scientific realism, is a much more successful theory to explain and predict why our phenomenology evolves the way that it does. Rather than solipsism. So that's an example of Bayesian epistemology solving a really fundamental philosophical problem.
So do you think that, because I think you are right, one of the, our education system does do a fairly inadequate job of teaching us. In fact, you talk about the inadequacies of mathematical teaching. I hate math. Just hate it.
Yeah.
I like words. I don't like numbers. In fact, one of the more well-known phrases that has been captured that I say is, "Don't give me the numbers, give me the letters." But do you think that this maybe ought be taught? This particular way of thinking ought be taught is almost like a form of critical thinking that almost maybe could supersede deductive or inductive. Yes. Should we move towards this as opposed to maybe, because we like old things, right? We prefer old things. So we much prefer to just still pretend as though Plato and Aristotle and Diogenes are relevant to and of course, there's a reason for that though. There's the reason, of course, being is that 80% of the planet or more still believe in some form of primary monotheistic deity that really requires, if you think about Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Hinduism, all of that requires the existence of the Platonic realm.
That's a good point. Yeah. Even if people don't know that, right? Even if they don't know the word for it, they don't know the theory. You're right. Like their worldview really is fundamentally Platonic. You like if they were to sit there and describe the furniture of it, you could say, yeah, shit, that's what Plato argued, and they might not even know that. But you're right. Yeah, I think that is a really popular worldview, and it's problematic if you're trying to be empirical, because it's not the most empirical of philosophical starting points.
Yeah, so we teach kind of, we teach like very, very simplistic forms of deductive, I think, reasoning. Inductive reasoning seems to be pretty, most people, I think, catch on, inductions pretty quick. Although I guess it seems that actually you're saying our mind works in a Bayesian way. I've always said that our mind works abductively. So I don't know.
Yeah, you're talking at the level of our abstract cognitive reasoning, right? Like figuring out social systems, figuring out facts, figuring out historical narratives. Yes, our brains suck at all of those things. They're not very Bayesian. What's Bayesian is the fundamental phenomenology. So like how our brain decides what exists. Like when I look around this room, my brain is inventing everything I see, but it's trying to invent things that correspond to real things. Like it's trying to guess. Let's try to guess that is a door over there. That this over here is that this is a whiskey. It's trying to figure out the shapes of things and all, and it's guessing. And it gets better at guessing. Like when you start out as a baby, you're shitty at guessing things. But over time, like literally, you train over years. And object permanence, right, is the thing that we don't even know coming out of the womb. That we don't even know that if I put this whiskey behind my head, it doesn't cease to exist. It's still there. That's called object permanence. It takes us years to figure that out as toddlers. And what's going on is our brain is doing statistical sampling of the data, and it starts figuring things out. But it's the Bayesian aspects of our brain are all fundamental perception, how our brain is constructing a reality. Now that doesn't mean it's flawless. Like it's bad data. It's once again garbage in, garbage out. So bad data can lead your brain making really bad decisions about what's really going on. But when we get to higher levels, and mind you, I'm talking about stuff that evolved before humans, right? So we're talking about the visual centers of the brain. Or pre-human, right? Like this is before the add-on that we put on top of lizard brain and all that is the abstract cognitive reasoning. That's a whole new piece of machinery, and that's much more analog, much more metaphorical, and prone to a lot of different cognitive errors. That is less Bayesian than most things. So you're right. Like what you're talking about, we were just talking about different things that the brain does.
So there is actually I don't want to call it a disease or a disability of any kind, but there is a quirk, I guess, that can occur in humans called latency inhibition, where you talk about humans being able to guess. We're learning how to guess. So the reason that we can walk through a door without any real thought is because we've walked through a door 1,000 times.
Right, yeah.
Where a robot, say, has to analyze every single door it's ever going through. Well, there's this latency inhibition where sensory input is not stored in the same way, I guess, in humans that have this issue versus the way we store it. So them seeing a door is seeing a door for the first time every time.
Oh, wow. Uh-huh.
So, of course, if you have someone with relatively low cognitive ability, it causes insanity. But you give it to someone with a fairly high cognitive capacity and you get classical genius, not like what we refer to geniuses today, but classical.
Oh, yeah. I haven't read on this, but this sounds familiar. Like I think I'd seen some discussion of this, but I haven't gone into it in deep. But keep going, yeah.
Well, and that seems to, kind of, frame onto what you're saying with the way that our mind works is that, like I guess our bottom brain, you're talking about this like big base, in the way we approach things. And it's because the latency is inhibited that these people with high cognitive abilities are forced to so overanalyze every detail all the time, where we just kind of, we've got the tunnel vision and we just kick out,
Yeah. Because they're required to navigate reality. They're required to use their imagination a lot more than we are. Right? Because so that's no. I think that's a good example of some of the quirks of how It's the thing is like if you meddle with how the brain normally works, you learn so much about how the brain normally works. It's like the best way to learn how a machine works is to break it.
So when should we? Because I think a lot of people would agree with you that we do need to revamp our education system, like seriously. Like I've got 2 children. I've got one in university. I've got one that's going through the 5th grade, almost to the 6th grade. I'll be in the 6th grade next year. And they don't. I've looked at my wife before, and I've said, "Why are they messing with Aristotle?" Like seriously.
Oh yeah.
Why? They come home with the Common Core and everything like this. But this. So should we supplant what we're teaching mathematically and things like this? So the way that we teach critical thinking early on with something like this, is that something that you would be?
And what already exists. I don't want to think like I'm inventing this wheel, but we need to teach math. This is what Common Core is supposed to do, and the big problem is that a lot of teachers don't know how to teach it. So there's the idea of what you're supposed to teach, and then there's implementation, and there's a big gap between those two. But the idea of Common Core is to teach math as a skill, not a bunch of memorization. So when I was taking math in high school, and I hated math in high school. I mean, I went all the way to calculus, but I got a C. So in calculus, but in high school, which is unusual. I was very math science oriented, but I was not a fan of math because it was just rote memorization. When I did trigonometry, I aced it, like it's no problem. But it was just they turning me into a computer. Here's a problem, here's a formula, A plus B equals C, and so I'm just doing what a computer does. I didn't even know what I was doing. I just knew how to run the formula. So I just was smart enough to remember the formula, smart enough to run the formula. I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. I didn't know, but I was good at it and I got an A. But it was useless, right? When I became a historian of science and I studied ancient science, and I had to learn why trigonometry was invented, why the ancient Romans and Greeks developed trigonometry, what problems they were solving with it. And once I studied like what they were doing and why it was useful, and then it was like a eureka moment again. I was like, oh my God, this is genius. Who invented this? Oh, right, they did. But that was the first time that I understood trigonometry, and I understood it as a skill in the way that if I had to rebuild it, like if I had to reinvent trigonometry or I was lost on an island, I now know enough to actually do that, because I was like, oh yeah, I know what they did, what problems they're trying to solve, and how they solved them. I could sit down and I could rebuild trigonometry from the ground up simply just by working through the problems, and not problems like equations, but I mean problems just like how do we solve this real world issue that I've got to solve. For instance, Ptolemy, the great astronomer, Roman astronomer Ptolemy, he correctly calculated the distance of the moon without a telescope and without laser finders, just using a stick, a string, and a clock. And you figure, like, how the fuck do you do that? Well, trigonometry was the answer. So it's when you look at it, like, the way that it works and stuff and the logic of it, teaching it as a skill. So like you're posed with a real world problem, not some abstract problem, but a real world problem, and say you have to solve this problem. And then you can throw some tools at them, like say, here's a toolbox, rummage around in that toolbox, see if you can find something that'll help you solve this problem. But when you start applying math as a skill, so that when you see the world, everything in the world as a mathematical problem you can solve as a skill, then you get math. But if all you do is you teach people to just memorize an equation and just run the equation like a computer, we don't need kids to be computers. We have computers for that, right? We don't need to spend years turning kids into calculators. You can just walk down the street and buy a calculator, right? Like, we don't need that. What we need are people who can reason mathematically, who can figure out, look at something and say, you know what? I know the mathematical structure that would help me like figure out this problem, this real world problem. That's what we need to do. And I think it's what we need to do in all fields. When I was in high school, I hated history. And here I am with a PhD in history. But I hated history because it was memorization, names and dates, memorization, blah, blah, blah. Super boring. I hated it. But when I got to college, it was method. It was about how do we know any of this is true? And it was about cause and effect. Like, why did this happen? And so I was like, these are way more interesting questions to ask about history. So I'm learning history as a causal system, and I'm learning history as a skill, like a methodology. And we're not doing that in high schools. We're not doing that at any grade that I know of before college. And I think you could pick any subject, even literature, even English, even grammar. Teaching it as a skill is way more important than a rote memorization thing. That was the thing that we were doing in the 50s, and we're still kind of following a lot.
Yeah, my son, I don't. Obviously, we're all teaching now. Like, our parents have become the teachers now, and of course, I grew up on the memorization thing. I mean, I'm not that old, but obviously, I'm older than I realized, because I grew up on the, you got the flashcards and the 1 times 9, 2 times 7, 4 divided by 6. What is it? And if you were to sit here and I can go down every single one, and my son looks at me like I've got some kind of magic going on. Right. And he's just like, what is this? And I can spit it out. But if you were to ask me why that's the answer, you said you went all the way to calculus. I think I went to algebra 2 in high school. And then I think I elected to do geometry because I just didn't want to do algebra anymore, right? I didn't want to mess with calculus. I didn't want to mess with differential equations or things like that. It was like, no, like, it's torture.
Right.
And it's like a magic to him. But I can't, there's a gap between me and him where he'll come to me with something from his school, and I'll look at it, I don't know what they're asking.
Right.
I don't understand.
Right. Yeah. Because they've changed what their goals are. Right. So it won't be familiar to us. Right. It's a new way of doing it. One of the tricks is usually what they're doing. You think of it in terms of what they're trying to do. Whether they're doing it well or not is another question. But what they're trying to do is teach a skill. So they're trying to teach a skill that can be adapted to other occasions. And so estimating is often a big part of it. So it's like they're not necessarily looking for the exact answer. They're asking for, can you figure out a way to quickly estimate this? Look, what would you do if you had 2 seconds to figure this out, or you die? And you don't need to be exactly accurate, just need to be ballpark. What would you do? Like, so they're saying, like, what skill would you develop? What tool would you develop to do it? So they're going for that. They're trying to get people to think in those terms, and that is tricky. And it's harder to teach. That's the other thing, is one of the reasons why we didn't do it and why we're not doing it so well is that it does require a higher level of more information in terms of learning how to teach it. There's more skill that teachers need, more education that teachers need to do this. Other countries are doing way better than us at this, but I mean, it's hard to get that because we won't.
Hey, do you mean that America doesn't do everything the best?
Yeah, don't get me started.
You mean there's other places in the world?
Vox does not speak for In Time. Her views are not necessarily the views of In Time. I believe that our corporate overlords do everything best.
Winning, damn it!
I was going to recommend. You'd mentioned one of your kids is going to be 6th grade soon.
Yeah, next coming up in the fall.
So do you know what I recommend? Even improving history, I recommend it because it's 6th grade math is the most you would need to really do simple Bayesian reasoning. Is I recommend Danica McKellar is actress and a mathematician. She's actually a published mathematician as well. She's written several books. She's done all the grades up to geometry, I think. Now the books she's written are sort of ostensibly aimed at girls, and they're very gendered in terms of their interests and stuff. So it is very much like this kind of like 1980s version of what girls and boys are interested in. But the book that 6th grade is called Math Doesn't Suck, and I highly recommend it, even for adults. I highly recommend it because 6th grade had all the math that we actually use in the real world all the time. Like, even if we're not aware of it, we're doing it. It's almost everything's in there, like probabilities and percentages, interest rates, and all the kind of the multiplication and division that we need to do. It's all in there. And what she does is she teaches it very colloquially with real world examples. Like if you for example, show you like the gendered nature of it is shopping. She has a lot of like shopping examples. You have to always you're shopping. You've got discounts. You've got limited amount. You've got a budget. You've got to figure this stuff out. And so she shows all of these skills that they're trying to teach at 6th grade, how they actually apply to solving real world problems that you will face even as a 6th grader, right? And so she has a lot of other things in there too. I find that the book is useful to read even just to understand what is the American assumptions about what girls like. And,
Oh, yeah.
and so and what sorts of things, like even girl culture in general, right? Which a lot of that's very useful. I think like boys would especially benefit from reading that, as long as they know in advance that you don't have to conform to that model. But
yeah, third wave Judith Butler feminists watching this right now are just sitting there going, "There is no girl culture, Dr. Kappa. Don't you know this?"
But it's a good book. That's what I'm saying. It's a great model for doing what I'm talking about, is teaching it as a skill. And this is what they need to do, is relate it to the real world, rather than just throwing abstract problems that aren't connected to anything and turn people into calculators. Pose people like actual real world problems and say, look how math solves this. And, oh yeah. And then once you can see how it applies, and it's people learn better when you tell a story. Like as in history, as you know, when I went through graduate school, that's what they teach you, is like telling a story is the best way to teach people history, because the human brain is really good at creating models based on stories. We're built for that. And you can learn math the same way too, by telling a story. Math, by solving a problem, is telling a story with real world objects, real world things going on, real social relations or whatever, rather than here's an equation, here's a quadratic equation, factor it. Like, oh my God, I don't even know what the hell I'm doing. Why? What use is this? You know, rather than teaching it that way, teaching it as a way that contacts the real world, I think is key to getting people excited by math and figuring it out.
It sounds almost like you're applying critical theory to mathematics, which is fantastic.
Yeah,
of course,
right.
there are the people that will watch this and they will come to me tomorrow and they will say, I done told you that critical theory stuff is the devil. I done told you that. Told me so. Jordan Peterson told me so, and I know it to be true. Oh my goodness. So I don't know how much time we have left because I'm actually on a mobile, so I'm not seeing my clock, but would it be difficult to say run through, just come up with an example real quick and run through, you know, your odds equation and just kind of say, okay, well, here's this is an example, and show us, you know, what the numbers are that we start and what the percentage comes out to be. How difficult would that be?
Well, the one that I can come off the top of my head is of course the one that I wrote a peer-reviewed book on, but it's Historicity of Jesus, right? And in that book, most of the book, I should say, is standard history. It's just facts, footnotes, right? Facts and footnotes, facts and footnotes.
Sure.
The math is very little. There's maybe a total of 10 pages of math in it. But what I do with the math is I take all the things that I've explained colloquially in words, and then turn it and show, like, what does this mean in terms of numbers? And to give you an example, when I get to I start with the prior probability, and I say, like, well, let's look at every hero from the ancient world about whom similar biographies were written. Miracle worker. I have all these features. You can list all the features that are distinctive of Jesus that he shares with all these other figures, and you can build a set of these guys. There's about 15 of them that are all kind of like they have basically 20 different features that are in common, 10 or at least 12 to 20 features that are in common, and you can look at that set of those and you look at them and say, like, how many of them actually existed? And the answer is, well, none, really. We have no evidence any of them existed. So what we found is a set in which usually, if you're in that set, you're a made-up person. And so what I do is then I try to build out my margins of error. Say, well, what if we're wrong about that? What if this is an anomaly? Like, and you can actually look. I'm going to stretch this as far as I can stretch it. I'm going to say, like, let's assume 4 of those 15 guys is historical, and I give some examples. It's like, let's just assume we have evidence they exist. We don't, but let's assume they do, and that's way beyond. Like, we have 0. The actual number is 0, so we're going to 4. We're going way beyond the bounds of the evidence here. We're being extremely generous to historicity, and if you do that, like, what then is the statistical odds that if you threw all these guys in a hat and you pulled one out at random, what is the probability that you would pull out a historical person? And the answer is 1 in 3, roughly, somewhere around 1 in 3. Well, Jesus is in that hat, and you can show Jesus is in that hat, which means that the prior probability that Jesus existed, that he's an exception, is 1 in 3 based on the prior evidence. Like, 1 in 3 of these guys is historical at best. Jesus is one of these guys. So before you look at the evidence, the prior is 1 in 3. And so then you go to the evidence. You say, well, let's look at each piece of evidence and say, like, how likely is this? Like, how much more likely? And I give some examples like the Gospels I find are a wash. They're equally likely that they'd have the content they have, whether Jesus existed or not. So they're not useful. But you look at, for instance, I'll even use an example of evidence for historicity. In the outside part of my margins of error, against mythicism, I find that Paul references brothers of the Lord twice in his letters. Now, I think I show a lot of evidence why that's actually completely expected, even if Jesus didn't exist, but set that aside. On my outside margins of error, I rate that evidence as 2-to-1. Like, it's twice as likely that Paul would say those things if Jesus existed than if he didn't, right? So I'm counting it as 2-to-1 evidence in favor of the historicity of Jesus. So you can take the 1 and 3 times the 2-to-1, and you end up with 2 and 3. So you'd have like slightly 67% chance that Jesus existed. It's 2 to 3 is your odds. And that's just if you only focus on that. Now there's a bunch of other evidence, and the numbers go in for all of that. But that's what you do. You look at what is usually the case, find your set, find a set of the people that are most like what you're talking about, and that there's enough of them you can get a rough estimate of the statistical probability that they existed, and then you look at the evidence. How likely is this evidence versus on one theory versus another? How well do they each explain it? And you can just work it out that way. And I end up with the total for the likelihood ratio. It ends up being a wash ultimately. That all the numbers actually not exactly wipe out, but close to. So that by the end of the equation, I end up with a 1 in 3 chance that Jesus existed on the outside. That's the highest probability that you could reasonably assign to the historicity of Jesus, which is a respectable probability. I mean, 1 in 3 chance there was a historical Jesus is not anything to laugh at, right? But it's too low for people. It freaks people out. Like, no, it's got to be above 50%. Surely it must be. No, it's not what I found. Even at best, with the most favorable arguments that you can come up with, once you look at all the data, you end up with 1 in 3. But it's that prior probability times the likelihood ratio gets you your result as the final odds. And that's what I do. And in chapter 12 of On the Historicity of Jesus, I have a whole table where I have every single item and what the ratio is. So you can go in and put your own ratios in and do your own equation and come out with your own probability. And I talk in that chapter about how to do that. So that's a good model that you can then apply to anything. You can apply it to QAnon conspiracy theories. You can apply it to climate science. You can apply it to flat Earth theory, or ordinary questions. Like Christians love to say that we never have evidence that someone loves us. And it's like, no, actually, you can do a Bayesian analysis on the probability that someone actually loves you. Like, there's actual data that's relevant to this. And we,
Does
so anyway.
my wife really love me?
So yeah, I would.
Does she know I have a boyfriend?
I nearly died of the hiccups once. I had an allergic reaction to cortisone. Had a very bad allergic reaction. Hiccups for about 14 hours. They had to knock me out. So I was talking to my wife about it. Oh yeah, it's an interesting story. But I'm talking to my wife about it, and she goes, "Don't worry, honey. If you had died, it would have said on your tombstone." And his last words were. So I'm gonna factor that into my calculation as to how much she really cares about me. I've got to tell you.
Actually, I would score that high because having a loved one go through the trouble of putting a pithy epitaph on your tombstone, that's love, honestly.
You and I gotta talk.
There you go. That's fantastic. I like it. Well, I'm out of questions. This has been fantastic. I don't know. I can't see the chat, which I'm usually able to do, so I can't tell if the audience has anything interesting to say.
I've been keeping up with the chat. I've put a couple of questions up. There was a lot of interesting questions. Our biggest, as soon as we had said that the Bayesian chances on solipsism were very low, Porpoise, of course, said, "Why am I arguing against solipsism?" But at any rate, so
because it's important to know why you reject it, right? It is the way that you do failure mode checks, right? Are you just delusional? like you really need to check that. Like you need to check in, right? And even if it seems absurd, like I have on my life, like, am I sure the Earth isn't flat? Right.
Right.
You know, like I've done an error check on that, and of course it checks out, so I'm like not worried. But I have gone through it like, wait, no, okay, yeah, but you got to do the check. And solipsism is a good one. It's a good example of why. Like, yes, we reject it out of hand, but why? Like, should we? Reject? I mean, yes, we should, but you need to know why. That's good philosophy.
A fella that I talk with on I guess who I encounter on a semi-regular basis, and you know, his whole shtick is that all atheists are solipsists, right? That's all they are. They just all think that they're all just, you know, minds and vats, and you can't prove anything, and they only think, you know, and on in this and on in this, and all he does is he's a presuppositional Christian, which, you know, tells you all you need to know.
Yeah, that tells me a lot.
But he's one of the nicer ones, right? He's one of the nicer ones. He rarely tells you you're going to burn in hell, which is, you know, nice. But, you know, his whole thing is just, well, you're just a solipsist. You're just a solipsist. You're just a solipsist. And so, and it's funny, you like that comes up in this, because I was talking to him today, and I'm like just sitting there going, look, we don't, you're confusing so many different things here. You're confusing certainty with knowledge. You're confusing, you know, Descartes with, you know, John Lewis, and you know, you're confusing all these things. Stop, you know. He's like, and like I thought I had gotten him to a point today where he was going to have like that aha moment, and then he just goes, but how do you know that? And I'm just like,
yep.
No.
But it's
no.
to answer that question. That's the thing. Like, that's the best way to test out, to burn test an epistemology. You know, and you burn test a new computer by, you know, really like hardcore using it and trying to make it break until it doesn't. Is with epistemology is do that. Like, yeah, can you explain why you claim to know this for things that you take super for granted? And you actually can learn some really interesting things. Because if you do it empirically, then you got to go look at, well, what has science already figured out about this? Right? And then you go down a rabbit hole. It's going to be fascinating, and you're doing all sorts of things about how do we know these things? How do we know whatever? And it's very valuable. I find these quests of challenging things we take for granted is a super useful philosophical enterprise. But you do have to be a reasonable person when you do it. You can't be like a paranoid delusional.
Yeah. I just remembered that basically this episode, Nick, has just basically been an explanation of the movie Along Came Polly. Have you ever seen it?
I have not seen that movie, no.
So Along Came Polly is a movie with Ben Stiller and Jennifer Aniston, and Ben Stiller is a insurance calculator, I guess, like insurance for people, like celebrity people, you know, and things like that. And so his job is to go in and determine the probability of whether or not they'll injure themselves, or they're going to have to pay out, this and that. And of course, he gets in trouble at the very end for using this, you know, this probability calculation to determine whether he should go back to his ex to date Jennifer Aniston. And of course she finds out, she's like, you put me in your probability, and he's like, oh. And it's a cute movie. And at the end, of course, he's like, he taught, and so I guess this would be the interesting thing though, right? Is at the end of the movie, he tosses it all aside and he says, probability be damned, I know that I'm right in going with you. So how sure can we be about these things when we run into a situation? And of course, that's like a matter of the heart. But like, I imagine that other things will come up where we're like, you know, because there are things that defy.
Yeah, that's
the art.
You know, do you know the theory, like the idea that the Spock version of emotions, the idea that you can get rid of emotions and only be reasonable, which is completely not psychologically true. Like if we had no emotions, we would just sit and starve to death. But Emotions are the reason for which we reason at all. Reason is just a tool to get the things that manipulate the emotions we want to control, happiness and sadness and so on. So Spock theory that you can be like this totally emotionless, rational person is not possible. But you're talking there. That's a really good example of another confusion people make. It's like the Spock version of probabilistic reasoning, is that there's epistemology, which is just the question of how likely is a thing. But the question is, what does it matter? Okay, so mattering is a different calculation, because that has to do with what is the cost of being wrong. So, for example, if the cost of being wrong is low, then we don't need to have a high certainty. We can just dive in, right? Because I can take the hit. Like, if I'm wrong, I can take that hit. That's not a problem. But if it's like the cost is high, like if I turn over the car and it blows up and I'm going to die, if you get into a car and it's a 1 in 100 chance that car is going to explode, you would never get in your car because the cost of being wrong is high. But if you're dating someone, you say, it's 1 in 100 chance that we will make it, but I'm going to take that chance. Like, we'll know within a few months, right? Like, we'll figure that out. And then we'll move on if it doesn't work out. But I'll take that odds, because the cost, like, if, at the worst case scenario, I'll have had a few lovely months with someone, right? And maybe like it doesn't end well, but then you move on, and then you meet someone else and so on. So like if the cost is low, the probability can be the same, but it would have a different effect on your decision. So what they're showing in that scene, I do remember that. I love the scene where they're don't lick the street. But anyway, that's
the keynote on the street.
I lived in Manhattan for 6 years, so that really resonates for me. But anyway. But yeah, it's a difference between what is the cost of being wrong versus what is the probability of the thing. And so that was showing him being obsessed about the probability, but not factoring in the cost, which wouldn't make any sense for an actual actuary. If he was actually an actuary, if it was well written, like by someone who was actually an insurance actuary, they would totally know that you have to put the cost in, because what is the cost is the whole fundamental thing they're trying to figure out. But the cost, you multiply the cost by the probability. So they're two separate things, right? So yeah, you got to keep that in mind, is the consequences of being right and the consequences of being wrong are what you're weighing. And then the probability tells you what the final cost will be, like what they call the expected cost. So that's gambling theory and yada yada. But yeah, to do good decisions, you have to bring in axiology. You can't just have epistemology. Epistemology just gives you the probabilities or the odds. But axiology has to be your values. Like, what am I going to lose if I'm wrong, or what am I going to gain if I'm right? And you have to actually figure in the values. You have to put your values in. And so that's not epistemology anymore. That is value theory. And yeah, you have to keep those separate. You can't get those confused. And that's a good example. I love that. That was a nice use of a film to illustrate. I often use films and film clips to teach things. Whenever I teach high school students, which I've done, Christian high school students, incidentally, I've used film clips. I had one time to get this is a digression we won't go into here, but I had a Christian teacher who wanted me to. He would often invite me to teach classes for his Christian high school students, and it was called Stand to Reason. So it was the idea they'd bring Christian high school students in to hear an alternate view, like a view from someone who is not a Christian, and then their faith should stand to reason. So what they do is they have us come in, give a lecture, we leave, and then they try to inoculate them against everything we just said, is what's really going on. But he wanted me to come in and give a lecture for Christian high school students on the ontology of moral facts. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, come on, that's got to be way too advanced for your students, right? It was like, no, they can handle it. They can handle it. I'm like, all right. So I'm like, how the hell do I teach this super advanced abstract idea of the ontology of moral facts to high school students? And I did it with film clips. So I had Pulp Fiction. Well, I didn't use Pulp Fiction because it had swear words in it. But I used that in another class. But I used Firefly, an episode from Firefly. I used Beautiful Mind, an episode from that. And Fearless with Jeff Bridges. So I used these scenes to illustrate and explain the ontology of moral facts using the film scenes. And that worked out really well. They responded really well and understood it and asked really intelligent questions. So I love using film to illustrate philosophical concepts, and using a goofy romantic comedy to do that is almost like a super successful win on like, well done.
Thank you. Well, now that you say that you've done that, well, now we're going to have to bring you back, because me and Dr. John Shook, the next time he comes on, we're going to.
Shook's a friend of mine. Yeah.
We're going to be doing kind of like introduction to meta ethics, and of course, because he, I believe, unless I'm misremembering, is some form of realist, and of course, I'm an error theorist. So it would be interesting.
I'm a realist as well. I'm even more a realist than he is.
There you go.
Yeah, we've taught ethics courses together actually before. So yeah, I know some of his work on this.
Well, we'll have to have you come back so you can both explain to me why my worship of J.L. Mackie is just completely out of the ballpark.
I would love to. That'd be awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I'll come in with I'll hit you with Philippa Foot and and Boyd and Railton and
There we go. That'll be fun.
All right.
No, that would be great.
Well, I think it's about time to start wrapping it up. Dr. Carrier, it was a pleasure as always. So thank you very much for coming. And we actually are going to have Dr. Shook scheduled. I think we had 2 or 3 planned for him. So we'll figure out when the next schedule is, and we'll see if you're available for that, because it would be great to have the 2 of you on for that one. So
I'll recommend him to the audience. He's interesting. He's an interesting fellow. So one of those people who has an actual PhD in what he's talking about. So so it's great. I recommend it. Check out his show.
Yeah, he's we enjoy having him on a lot. So we're gonna also have overtime tomorrow, 9 p.m. Although Vox and I have been talking about maybe moving the shows up. So we'll see. But tomorrow, so far, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time overtime. We're going to be covering, at a minimum, Texas, which is having some significant power issues, and we're going to talk about. There have been some updates on Myanmar and the death of. Oh my God, I'm what's his name? Limbaugh.
Oh, Limbaugh.
Limbaugh died today. See ya.
Right?
Is that the Vader theme? Oh dear Lord. So
next on the Golden EIB network, Rush Limbaugh has met his maker. Dun dun.
If there is one, I am thoroughly convinced he did not go in that direction. But nonetheless, Donald Trump called him today a legend, and he is that. But not all
even
legends
if
are
there
good.
are directions to go, he didn't go that way.
Yeah.
He is definitely infamous. He is definitely infamous. That's for sure. So I'm looking forward to that. Yes.
Yep. So that'll be tomorrow night, and then we also have 2 upcoming shows. So we did the one where we did we actually had Mowdy on. I almost called him Richard Mowdy. Wow. Okay. We had Mowdy on for the Matter of Perspective, the Star Trek episode where Riker was accused of committing murder. 3 different perspectives on all the same set of facts, and they recreate and go through all of these things. Nobody's lying; they're all telling the truth. But the 3 different versions, for the most part, all hang him, except for his version in which he's innocent. So we were also going to do, since we really enjoyed that, we're going to do one where we're going to do another. We're going to do actually a Deep Space Nine episode. It's going to be Duet, and then we're also going to do since so many people here have not seen War Games. We will stream War Games in the Discord. Anyone who wants to come join us can join us for that, and then we will do a lot
people
of people
who haven't seen War Games. Okay, go on.
Yeah, I know, right? We're going to correct that.
Don't know what it is.
It is a classic. It holds up. I watched it again recently. Once you understand that it's set in the 80s, it holds up.
I think it's a spectacular movie, and we had some discussions on it, and a number of our viewers hadn't seen it, so we're going to stream it, and then we are going to do after party hang, and all of us are going to sit and discuss it. I'll send you a link, and you're more than welcome to join us for that, Dr. Carrier. I'm sure everybody would love to have you come in on that. And then let's see. So, and then we've got Shook planned for a couple of episodes. I got a few more things coming up. So until then,
I'm done with my. I'm ready to give it to the peers. The ontology of gender, I have finished it. It's ready. It's good to go. I've checked all my T's. I've dotted all my I's. I'm ready to send it to the peers for review. So we will be booking that show very, very soon.
I'm super interested in that. I'd like to be included in that if possible. I mean,
absolutely.
in the Send, anyway.
Well, I'd love to have you. In fact, what I'll do is I will drop all of my information into the back area. You can look at it, tell me what you think, and then when we set the date, Nick will work with you, and absolutely, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, Nick, send me a link, whatever links are relevant to that, so I can figure out where all that is.
I think she's going to drop it on the Skype that you're connected with, so that it's going to be in the chat that we have right now. But anything else, I can certainly keep in touch with and get you a hold of. In fact, we can upload anything to the In-Time Drive too. And
I'll join you guys in the Discord tonight too, I think.
Oh, perfect.
Awesome.
Perfect. So we'll have that link dropped again. If I think that's been dropped recently, but we'll drop that again in just a few minutes. We also, let's see, we also are going to do the Evergreen. No, we did Evergreen. We're going to do the Grievance Studies.
Grievance Studies.
I think that's going to be a week from yesterday. On Tuesday, we're going to do the Grievance Studies.
Homoerotic dog rape.
Yep.
That's what we're going to do.
Yep, that's going to be. And then, with any luck, we are going to get Ozzy for. We're still reaching out to him, but he's back.
Are you aware of the Grievance Studies, Dr. Carrier?
No, fill me in on this.
So Grievance Studies is a group of professors got together because they were tired of the peer review process and its holes, and so they started publishing fake stuff. Started out mundane, and then by the end of it, they had won awards for getting papers published such as the homoerotic fantasies of dog rape in parks and things like use of dildos for the destruction of homophobic tendencies amongst evangelical Christians, and they were published and peer reviewed. And of course, the purpose behind all that was to show that our peer review process is, of course, falling behind. It's lacking.
I looked into that and explored that and wrote on it a long time ago. Well, a few years ago. Even physics has this problem. They have bogus journals that fly flags that make them look like they're honest. And someone literally published an article that just says something like "fuck you," or whatever, or this paper is false, or it's just repeated the same sentence over and over again, and they got that published. So there are a lot of examples of this. I didn't know that there was a whole consortium who was trying to
three
people. That's actually. I'm glad that happened, because that is a great way to actually start scoring the value of peer review in journals, because you can actually you send up these false flags and see how many get through. It's just like how you test the security of an internet network, right? Is you keep trying to hack it, and the one that gets hacked all the time, that's not reliable. So you can actually build scores. If you were to build this out as a regular thing, you could actually build scores for journals, how likely is a bullshit paper to be accepted by this journal, and that would be a valuable score to have, and it would actually kind of restore the reputational value of peer review. So I'm excited by that concept. I hope it ends up being a bit more developed project than it sounds, but still, I'm glad that's being done.
They've been denounced as frauds now, and they've got all these other. They are not, the academia is not pleased with them for publishing fake papers, but nonetheless, So we're gonna. But
they're justified. Whole other argument, but let's get to the Discord, and I'll join you guys there.
So we'll be in Discord in about 3 minutes. Thank you all for joining us, and we will catch you tomorrow.